Chapter 17. Medical ethics and the right to die a dignified death. You know, I had to wrestle with this question several years ago when I watched my own dad die. I saw his body deteriorate over a period of several years to about 100 pounds. I was never confident about his last surgery, and I told some people I think we should just pass on this one. They insisted that if he did not have this surgery, that he would die of a stroke or a heart attack. My thoughts on that was better a stroke or a heart attack than to kill him on an operating table. Well, the surgery backfired and we lost him. All he did for about the last 10 days of his life was beg for more painkillers, and finally one day he lifted up his head and said, "Would it be okay if I just gave up?" And 2 days later he was gone. That is really not the way that anybody wants to say goodbye. Now, did you know that there was a plea in the Bible for a dignified mercy killing? You have to read between the lines, but it's there, and I'm going to set the stage so we'll understand this request. You know, in Job chapter 1, there was this cosmic battle between God and Satan, and Job ends up in the middle. Job loses everything in one day. He loses his sheep, his camels, his oxen, his donkey, his kids, his health. He loses everything except his wife. And the most amazing thing happened when most of us would have cursed God and Job instead fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked came I from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Now, here's the plea for the mercy killing. When Job's wife saw his suffering and his incredible loss, she said, and I quote, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die?" Now, there was a belief in the ancient Hebrew culture that if you cursed God, your name was next on the list. And Job's wife loved him so much that she could not bear to see him suffer like this. So the statement, "Why don't you curse God and die?" was actually a plea for a mercy killing. Now, her response is always misquoted. Job said to his wife, "You speak as a foolish woman." The way it's usually quoted, unfortunately even in a lot of sermons, is supposedly Job said, "You are a foolish woman." That's not what he said. He didn't say you are a foolish woman. He said you speak as a foolish woman. Now, here's the deal. She did not want him to die. She simply wanted his suffering to come to an end. You know, when my dad finally died, I was not glad that he was gone, but I was glad that his suffering was finally over. Now, they did a special on 60 Minutes a few years ago stating that 60% of the Medicare budget was spent keeping people alive in the last 4 months of their lives, terminally ill patients. And they said that over the next 20 to 30 years, this would cripple our economy and we would have to start making some tough decisions about life and death. The problem with that, anytime you bring this up, it's political suicide. Now, in most nations of the world, when you get old and start losing your way, they just let nature run its course the way it's been done since the beginning of time. Now, this does not mean that you lack compassion. It means you simply understand that everyone has an appointment with this thing called the grave. But I do want to issue you one warning in the middle of this that, be careful when people start to make decisions about life and death based purely on economics. Because in some situations, what started out as the right to die eventually became the duty to die. Okay, so this is what we call the slippery slope of human depravity, which brings me to my next point. Let's talk about playing God. When it comes to the decision of leaving someone on life support or unplugging them, I'm always dismayed to hear people say, "You're playing God." If you talk to what's called an old order Amishman, they will tell you that the person playing God in this equation is the doctor that hooked that terminally ill patient up to a life support machine in the first place. Now, I understand, too, there's a difference between hooking someone up to a life support machine that's 15 or someone that's, 85, and can this person have quality of life? I understand there's a lot of wiggle room in that equation. But here's going back to playing God. It all depends on what your definition of playing God is. Remember, not everyone who loves God sees the world through your eyes, okay? Now, having been raised on an acreage in central Iowa my whole life, I have seen a bewildered animal put out of its misery more than once. they get old, they can't hardly walk or talk or see, and as a kid, I had several Shetland ponies that were taken off to a glue factory because they could hardly function anymore. And in the words of Solomon, there was a time to be born and there is a time to die. And we need to accept that that is a fact of life, that everything has a cycle to it. Now, one of the things, too, that I can't seem to understand in our American culture is why we're so apprehensive to talk about death. When I was a kid, I think if I remember right, I was about 8 years old at the time, and my grandmother took me and one of my brothers to a local cemetery to show us their grave sites. Now, what's interesting about this is she was probably 55 at the time. And I remember Grandma telling us that they bought these 2 burial plots right after they got married. Now, for most 20-somethings today, that would be the last thing on their radar after a honeymoon. Oh, honey, let's go pick out our burial plots. But I believe that there's a powerful lesson in this story that, the thought of, number one, the thought of leaving each other was never a consideration to them. We will live together and we will die together till death do us part. But the second thing is we live in a society that refuses to talk about the reality of a graveyard, which is a perfect lead-in to my next chapter.